everybody. Welcome to another Sparking Interest podcast. Recently, we've had some notable people come to the ASFP offices to talk to us, and we're continuing that trend today. Yes, indeed. But it's I'm not going to retract that because notable, I think, is a word that some of you who have experienced listening to our guest at some of our events would probably confirm is true. So today I'm with Chandru. He's the director of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Chandru recently, or when I say recently, last year, was good enough to come along and talk at the ASFP's event at the Aviva building, which is a yearly event we do, and is very well attended. And then we managed to convince him to come and talk to us here today on one of the Sparking Interest podcasts. And we're going to try and fill your day, your viewing day, with as many of the things that you probably would, if you were here, would ask Chandru questions on. So without further ado, Chandru, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to Coventry. And I'm sure Coventry probably is an absolute perfect case study for the Department of Levelling Up.
Yep.
And how we obviously level up the equity across the UK. We're here, along with a number of other trade associations, actually, British Coatings Federation, and just down the road is the Association for Modular Building.
Yeah,
the MPBA, Modular Building Association. So there's a few of us around here. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, of course, the ASFP is passive fire. You've been good enough to support us with attending a couple of our events. We tend to get an awful lot of engagement when you're involved talking to us. You are of interest to our members in the extreme. So thank you for coming. And I'm not going to say you're putting yourself on the spot, because that isn't, of course, what we're here to do. We're here to be far more positive than that and talk about how we can support our members and the wider industry in a lot of the things that your departments are involved with and sponsoring and supporting and driving, because I know the Right Honourable Mr. Gove has, a passion for driving this through, and rightly so. So in terms of, I suppose the sort of first question is, recently the long-awaited report, the Morrell report, as I think it's sort of become the sort of the urban myth name for, because of course no one had seen it until a month or so ago. In terms of that report, what's your and the department's sort of reaction to that report? I believe it was commissioned originally by the Department of Levelling Up in the first place. Did it give the answers that you thought it was going to give, and has it sort of evolved the solutions to what we think needs to be done to improve things yet further?
Yeah, really interesting questions. Can I start by saying I'm really happy to be here?
I hope you are.
No, genuinely.
Yeah.
Because actually I'm very keen to hear more about what industry is doing,
yeah,
and how industry is operating and how you are taking things forward. So I'm really pleased with how ASFP is moving forward, and I'll be watching and cheering from the sidelines in government and outside.
Of course, but you can get on the pitch as well.
No,
if you want to.
Only if you're willing to sub me in.
Of course.
Also, Coventry isn't new to me, and you're right. It is a wonderful case study in levelling up, and we were here just a few months ago with senior leaders from across government. And we spent a whole week in Coventry visiting industries, visiting organisations, and seeing really the rejuvenation of an area which is just so beautiful,
yes,
and wonderful, and such amazing people.
And of course,
so
HS2
really
is just
exactly
over that way. And I think, regardless of what people think of HS2, we have to develop as a nation, we have to develop our means of being able to, use all of the assets of the country, as opposed to that rather cramped bit down in the bottom northeast corner.
Strongly agree, and that's the point of levelling up. It's sometimes described as we're a country that's operating on one engine, when we have 4 or 5, and actually how do we get the whole country really driving? Yeah. And I think that's essential. In terms of the Morrell-Day Report, because of course,
yes, I do. I do them discredit by. Of course, I was calling it the Morrell Report because that seems to have what it turned the slang, the terminology
term.
Seems to have
but it was
come into
Annalisa
that.
Day and Paul Morrell
Indeed, it was.
who are both heavily involved in that report. And so I think it's an excellent report. Let me start with that. Let me tell you my love for construction products. So I was given a choice about 4 years ago what area I might want to go and look at and be involved in, and my hand went up for construction products, oddly enough.
Okay.
And that's because I find it absolutely fascinating. It's a regulatory regime that affects all of us every moment of every day in ways that we don't realise or we don't even know about. And so I find it fascinating. But also, I was also acutely aware that it was going to be absolutely critical that we get this regime right if we are going to have a safe regime for buildings and for living in buildings in the future. And for me, this was an area that had been ignored far too long. And in a sense, when you looked over all of Europe, everyone assumed everyone else was doing something. And so it's a fascinating area that I really wanted to get into. So when Morrell-Day were asked to review this, I already had a bit of knowledge. I wouldn't say huge amounts of knowledge, a bit of knowledge and a bit of awareness into some of the issues that were in the system. I think the report itself was excellent. It is very detailed.
It is. Yeah.
It points to several failings across the system, and it tries to maintain that system approach in diagnosing exactly where the issues are. And I think it's an excellent report in doing that. Do I think it's captured everything? I think it's captured more than I knew. I don't know whether it's captured everything. You never really know about these things. You sort of find as you lift up the stones and you dig the earth, you discover even more. And so, in a sense, I think he has and Annalisa have both done a brilliant job in describing an incredibly complex regime in a way that enables us to look at it in discrete areas and make sure that the sum of it is better than the parts, would be my take. What does that mean in terms of driving this forward and doing reform? There are some prior questions which the report seeks to ask, which I think are important to answer first, such as, what is the purpose of markings?
Yeah.
How should the regime work in relation to CE marking in Europe? And I think there are these prior questions which it asks, which we as government need to answer before we start to drive through how we want to reform this regime. And in a sense, that is what we announced once the report was published, which our Secretary of State was very clear. We want to reform this sector. This report provides a great diagnosis of the problem, and now we need to look at how the system should be reformed.
Yeah.
And so that is what we are doing the work on currently, and hopefully we will engage the sector. Not hopefully, we are engaging the sector, and we want to engage the sector even more as to how this regime will operate in the future, and address some of those fundamental issues which Morrell-Day both point to, but also deal with some of the detailed questions in relation particularly to test houses and conformity assessment bodies, how they operate. So that's sort of where our head is. We're up for this. We've announced we're up for this. The report is excellent, but now we need to make sure what we end up with is a simpler, coherent regime that delivers on safety for everyone.
Yeah, and I think you wouldn't. Nobody at the ASFP or any of our members would argue on the principle of that. I mean, not just the principle, but the fact that all of our members say to us, we constantly want to evolve, we want to develop, we want to improve, we want to be part of the improvement journey. They're in a slightly they're in a challenging position, of course, that they are commercial businesses. Yeah. They have owners, they have shareholders, And of course, that brings a whole series of challenges in the sense that the ASAP has a real mix of members. I mean, for a start, we cover our core membership is the manufacturers and the installers of pacifier products and systems. But outside of that, we have an awful lot of membership, and pro rata, probably the largest growing area of designers, engineers, tier one contractors, people within the tier one contracting world of procurement, engineering, all the way through to people who work within the authorities like approved inspectors, local authority building control, all the way down through occupation and into facilities management. And that part of our membership is growing. And to a person, everybody is committed to that journey. And of course, we're doing our part in terms of the things that you and I have spoken about, and we're talking to our members about, and we're putting out there about the improving standards ourselves. But I think their biggest challenge is how do they tackle the myriad of things that are sort of coming at them at the moment that they have to start to develop towards and improve on top of their own commercial operation, on top of things that actually are sort of the norm now. So, 9001, you have to have your policies and your systems in place. 14001, environmental. On top of changes in employment law, health and safety, the challenges they face in terms of things like insurance premiums going up, because of course everything has become risk averse until it becomes clearer on how things can be measured better, across the entire scope. And I think what our members are looking for, and probably a broader, cross section of people as well, is how do we tackle these things in small bite-sized pieces and enable people to do the things that they want to do because they know they should, or because it's part of their own evolvement as a business anyway. It's how we get them to that first page, I think, is probably the way I would present it. If we took a typical business, I don't know, turns over 3 or 4 million a year, it's got 30 staff, and they install passive fire protection, or they manufacture a couple of products, what do you think the first thing is that they should look at and focus on and gear themselves towards?
Cool, you're probably asking the wrong person that. But
from the point of view of your position.
Yeah, let me give you some thoughts. The first thing I'd say is where there's complexity, people tend to assume someone else knows what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And then they default into simplicity, which is usually wrong or not assured.
Yeah.
Right. And so there is this element here of do we have sufficient leadership in the sector that can support people to navigate the complexity which is in there? I'm not convinced that we have it across all of the sectors that we operate in. And you mentioned Morrell-Day before, and, in a sense, their report said that no one really knew how this system worked, and everyone assumed everyone else knew how it worked.
Yeah.
And so people were building on ground which was not stable. Could they trust that the performance of a product achieved the stated performance? Did CE marking mean a product was safe or not? Well,
for me, CE marking is to show that if a teapot is made in Britain, France, Italy or Spain, it's the same teapot.
Yeah, so exactly right.
It's continuity as opposed to
it's about a single market as opposed to necessarily performance, right? So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, have we built the foundations correctly for us to then build from and build on? And I think construction products and materials is one of those foundational areas which we need to get right. And that's why we're reforming that currently. Then you sort of say, if I can trust the foundations which I'm operating on, how do I navigate this complex system? And it is complex.
It is,
to deliver safe homes for people to live in, regardless of what I do in building this home. Now, in that regard, I think there is still far too much complexity. So we are looking at approved documents, we are looking at standards, and we are looking for answers here, and we want industry to help us. And it's not government's job, I should say. In a sense, you could argue government's simplicity is in the regulations, and the regulations are functional in their very nature. And so they set out functional requirements. And really what we want to see more of is industry leadership showing how you interpret those functional requirements into any given circumstance to make the buildings and the developments and the operations and the way people work simple and easy. And so people can join a company without skills. They can be an apprentice. They can move up the ranks. They can learn the right things at the right time. But they're not put on work before they're ready.
Of course,
but when they are put on work, even then, there is the opportunity to make mistakes. And this is where industry can also help with third-party certification and auditing and support to make sure that the works are done correctly. Because not everyone can't hold every bit of information at the same time. So there is an element here of how do you help people shortcut that and navigate that effectively. And for that, I think we need leaders. Right? So I see ASFP as a leader in this area. And I know some of the work that you're doing in this field is about both training people to be competent, but also helping them to continuously develop and also assure the work that they're doing through third-party schemes, etc. So I absolutely see it as that. But for that to work, we really, really, really do need leaders. Now, that's talking about safe buildings. What you were describing was a hugely complex context in which everyone's operating in, and all of the commercial pressures which are coming at them in the market and the regulatory environment, which is shifting the ground in which they are perhaps operating in. That, unfortunately, is the reality of how we all have to operate.
It's the reality of life, isn't it, really? It is. We talk about, looking for leaders. And, of course, there is a sort of generally understood, sorry, just not my microphone, it's me waving my arms around too much. There's a generally understood sort of body politic within the design and construction industry where tier ones tend to sit somewhere at the top of that, but then there's this relationship between the principal designer and principal contractor. So we know there's a few pinch points in the sense of the relationship and the responsibilities between designer and contractor, and what filters down from what is handed from principal designer to principal contractor, how they interpret that, how that then gets moved into the subcontractor world.
I worry about that a little bit, if I'm honest, right? So I think that's great in terms of accountability.
Yes.
But it's not great in terms of competency or professional ownership.
No, the practicalities of it are very different. It is a very different thing.
And this is where I think trade associations have a really important role to play. So for me, a company should always be part of a trade association, would be my starting gambit. I say always, they can decide, of course. But being part of a trade association, in a sense, gives you your joint or collective leadership across the sector that then enables all companies to operate in a level playing field and in a way that's navigating the context, but also the requirements effectively, and holding everyone to high standards, not seeking to move to the standards of the lowest denominator. Right? And so in a sense, I see trade associations as an essential part of our ecosystem that are driving standards upwards, helping their members to navigate complex contexts, and making sure that principal contractors or designers aren't necessarily driving standards down, but actually holding those standards up and saying this is, and where it isn't happening, shouting, letting us know, and so that we can address that. So that I really do think that's essential.
Yeah, and I think it's the collaboration between the associations is important as well, because I mean the ASFP is quite an interesting. It's probably a very good example of that. Is that passive fire as a science or a discipline, whatever you want to call it, crosses through so many different parts of the construction, design and construction sector. You know, some trade associations are representative of quite a narrow field of product or of work, whereas passive, you know, crosses, we run through so many different things. So we collaborate with other associations like the British Woodworking Federation, the Federation of Interior Specialists, the National Association of Shop Fitters, NAS, and the Modular MPBA, and many others. And one of those collaborations is that we're looking at developing is with the RIBA, because, you know, when people see this podcast and hear what I'm going to say next, I guarantee you no one's going to say you're wrong, because I know I'm not wrong. For people studying architecture at university, you know, there's three parts. Your first, part one is at uni, your part two is a placement, your part three is your final sort of dissertation and your projects, etc. We've done some quite extensive studies on the amount of time that students, certainly in their part one, spend
it's not sufficient
on passive fire.
It's not sufficient.
So 3 years at university, about half a day.
Yeah, I was going to say a day, and
half a day.
Yeah, I know, it's not sufficient.
So they don't leave university having the thought processes of how passive fire works, needs to be interfaced, designed in, where it needs to go, where it doesn't necessarily need to go, for what reason, how it's applied. They leave university not having that. They learn that in the field. Now, I'm speaking at first hand because my son...
Well, can I say, at the moment, they hope they learn it in the field.
Yeah.
Because there's no requirement to.
No, there isn't.
There's no specific training
Absolutely
course.
Right. Yeah.
But that's changing.
Yeah. And there's
So
also no
rebar,
requirement to evidence that you've learnt
exactly,
it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So rebar and ARB, the Architects Registration Board, are collectively looking at how you introduce continuous professional development to the sector.
Yes.
And hopefully that will happen very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And in response to Dame Judith's report and what happened at Grenfell Tower, we are very clear that safety and passive fire must form a significant part of that. And I know REBA are taking it very seriously, as are ARB.
Yes. And we're engaging with REBA on that basis. Yeah. But no, you're right. 'Cause my son's just finished his second year at Nottingham doing architecture. Yeah. And he's the Nottingham University advocate for passive fire. It's much to some of his lecturers' disdain that he keeps going on about, passive fire all the time. So yeah, and it's the evidencing which is the important part. Just going back to the report that we started this conversation about.
I should say it's the evidencing and continuous professional development, because these things don't stand still.
No, they don't. No.
And so, and even for everyone working in this sector, how do you continuously develop is so important.
It's evolution, not exactly. Well, we need a revolution to then continue the evolution. I think that the one thing that somebody once said to me that the Grenfell thing was a full stop. In fact, actually, it was an exclamation mark. I don't think that anything like that could ever be that, because of course you can't have that position of status quo ante. What was before will never be the same again, in the sense that these things tend to be these semicolon moments where everybody takes a pause, looks in the mirror. A lot of if you're looking out the window, your head's not in the right place, because everybody on this needs to look in the mirror, and then we move forward and evolve from where we are. We're talking about standards. If you look at if ever a new standard is launched for a product, for instance, product standards are not 100% brand new content. Yeah. They're made up of bits and parts of other standards that relate to that new standard, and I think that's part of. It's part of the success of how we develop standards, but it's also part of the problem, because, of course, inherently, if you've got a rogue gene within those normative references within that standard, it tends to sit within standards that then follow on. And it's actually, I think, that's part of the challenge, is to sort of to take apart these things and say, well, actually, so
really interesting. So what's my take on that? My take is standards are important, essential, right? And they enable markets to operate. They enable your people to work with confidence and certainty. So they are important. And if they are changed all the time in rapid succession, that creates the uncertainty and the distrust in standards that was actually not beneficial to the sector. Now, that said, there is something, and I feel this, and I feel this, and there is something within the sector where standards have become gods almost, and there is a protection of the status quo, which is very hard to challenge. And when you get a sector in that space, actually there is something about how do you introduce a disruptor? How do you bring a little bit of challenge to this? And it's not to say that what you've got is wrong, but it's to say, is what you've got always right all the time?
Yeah.
And that is something I think we do need to look at, and I think may be part of reform work. I don't know yet. It's really up to the sector to help us think through this. But how do you create that disruptor that enables us to take some standards and really test and check whether they are fit for purpose with new technologies that are emerging, with new ways of designing, with new ways of building, and make sure that the status quo is maintained where it is right and where it works. But where it doesn't work, actually, we are aware of that and we can take action quickly.
And we make the corrective action. We make that provision of change, and rightly so. I think that sort of leads on. Obviously, one of the things that sort of was running parallel almost to the Morrell-Day Report was obviously the proposal to remove 476 from ADB. Now. Prior to me joining the ASFP, I was working for a member company, and predominantly that business was not testing to 476. They were testing to European classifications and classifying to the same. So I can sort of see it from both sides. I worked within the European system, the classification system, and I was very aware of 476. Saying that, if you look at the standards that you would test and classify to, one of the biggest references within those is the 476 standards, 2022 in my case. And I think that's a moment where you say, well, one system is more robust. It has probably a greater level of transparency. The testing regime in quite a lot of cases is more robust. You can then classify, which gives a greater level of sort of visibility in terms of how that product would perform. That would align nicely to the requirements of CCPI of correctly listing the performance qualities of that product. And I would struggle to see how anyone would argue against that. But of course, just going back to my original sort of how I framed the first question of, we have members and they're looking for a light to follow to, help them through this sort of maze of things they have to do. Of course, when a statement's made of proposing to remove 476 from ADB, of course, it's an easy thing to say. But then, of course, the practicalities. It's the rocket science, rocket engineering. Yeah. We want to send 3 people to the moon and bring them back safely. Yeah. Tick. How are we going to do that? Oh, now there's a question. Yeah. And of course, for our members, it would be the word transition. How and in what timescales would be considered to be reasonable from transitioning from the removal of that suite of standards going and move it towards classification within that approved document. And I think that's a question. If I had 10 of our members in this room today, the question they would ask you is not that it shouldn't be done, but the degree in which it should be done, because there's probably some good bits of 476. And why chuck them out if it doesn't, for the sake of then having to just put it back, and actually what you put back is pretty much the same as what you've just taken out, because in certain areas that's the only way you sort of can do it. But they would sort of say, well, what does the transition look like if that's going to be the case?
Yeah. So, look, that's been out to consultation.
Of course.
So I can't get into the detail of it. So let me talk about principles.
Principles are good.
Yeah.
We'll go with principles.
So the first thing is it's always worth just reminding ourselves that the regulations are functional.
Yeah.
They are not specific in relation to standards or devices, but they are functional, and the requirement is to demonstrate how you meet those functional requirements. And statutory guidance, again, it's worth reminding ourselves that that is what it is. It's statutory guidance, as in it is one way that you can demonstrate how you meet those functional requirements. It's not the only way. Now, saying that, I do recognise that the industry would argue, and rightly so, that statutory guidance sets the framework in which you demonstrate compliance.
Yeah.
And if you can't demonstrate it through how you meet it through the statutory guidance, then you can't demonstrate it at all. And I sort of buy the argument. I buy and I don't buy that argument. But let me take that as okay, right? Then I would say, if you know what the functional requirements are, which is all about safety of life, right?
Of course. We're only here for that reason, effectively.
Exactly. So it's all about safety of life. And then you know what the statutory advice is saying.
Yeah.
What we need to make sure is whatever we do in statutory advice is ultimately achieving both the functional requirements and the overall objective here. And so in doing that, I would recognise that withdrawing a standard will be challenging for some sectors. And actually, while simplifying statutory guidance might be desirable and would be helpful in terms of taking some of that complexity you were talking about earlier out of the system, doing that too quickly and too rapidly can also create an unsafe environment because people can't do it.
It leaves a vacuum, doesn't it?
Yeah,
effectively?
So there's always a balance as to how you go about moving from one regime or one system or one standard to another. What I would say here is this is not for government at the moment. This is with HSE.
Yep.
HSE must advise government on the best way to achieve our outcomes. And then following that, ministers will need to make a decision, both in terms of what they want to do, how they want to do it, and the transitional arrangements around it. But to say that we recognise that we do, but I'd also encourage the sector to embrace the simplicity of a single standard as opposed to multiple standards.
Yeah, and I think that's yes, because